My name is Yves Muya. It's spelled Y-V-E-S and U-I-A, for those of you who don't know. And I was born in Congo, in Central Africa. I was about 10 when we left Congo. It started when the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 happened. So he had two troubles. It was a trouble war between the Hutus and Tutsis, and basically over a period of 100 days, you had people that were persecuted. Over 100,000 people were killed. And so the people that perpetrated that war ended up running into Congo to find refuge in order to hide. So in order for them to survive, they start pillaging villages and small towns and cities, to survive. So a lot of communities and towns and villages kind of realizing that we don't want these men and women, these men to come into our home, violate our daughters and take our sons and soldiers. So pitchfork armies started rising up all over Congo. A soldier came into our home the one time and pretty much threatened my parents and left, and they told us they were coming back the next day. So my parents picked up everything. We started heading down towards Zambia. So we ended up crossing the border into Zambia. We started running out of resources because at the time we thought being in Zambia was just going to last for a couple of weeks and we'll just go back home and pick up life where we left off. And after we started running out of resources, the Zambian government didn't want to give us any sort of immunity to stay in the country, so we ended up spending at times 3 to 4 days, sometimes 2 days without food. It got really hard in terms of, just as a kid, because you just want to play, you just want to have fun. I just remember every time my dad, would come back at home, and when we haven't eaten for 2 days, and you're hoping that, you see the door opening and you're hoping that he's got something in his hand. Most of the time there was nothing. So we got really desperate, and so my dad ran into this guy who told him about this word, refugee, this term. We didn't really know what a refugee is, and so we started inquiring about what it is to be a refugee. And we're told a refugee is a person that has run away from a war-afflicted country to find refuge in a foreign land. And I just remember kind of how this revelation came to our family. We were all sitting in a room kind of looking at each other. It's like, oh, we are refugees. And but we were so desperate. We heard there was a program in Malawi, a country east of Zambia, that had a refugee program. So I remember we packed up everything we had and sneaked across the border. I remember when we got into Malawi, my parents got interviewed as to why they left Congo, as to why it's not safe for our family to go back. We jumped into these buses and then we started going. We drove for about 6 to 8 hours. And all of a sudden there was like this camp, refugee camp. It was just displacement camp that was in the middle of nowhere. And there was just thousands of people from all over Africa, from all walks of life. I'm talking about people from people from Angola, people from Congo, people from Somalia. Every war-afflicted place, people were all in there. I've never seen anything like it. There was just tents of people. And so they gave us a small tent. There were 7 of us. It's like maybe not even 10 foot wide. And you have to hunch to get in and get out. So every month in a refugee camp, we had to line up for a handout, which means that the people that were hosting the camp would bring in truckloads of food, of rice, corns, beans, oil, the stuff that you need to survive. The brutal part about it is that we had to line up. We had to wait a line sometimes 3 days at a time until we'll be served. People get into fights, people die, and now and then you'll see people's bodies being dragged across because they got into a fight, because they lost their place online. And I think that's kind of when we all quickly realized that we cannot survive the camp. It was really hard for our family to survive, and so my parents we all started talking, how can we get out? But we knew we didn't have money, we didn't have any resources. The only thing we had is the food that we just received. And this was the first month of that happening. And I remember my dad coming up with this wild idea. It's like, well, why don't we take half a portion of our meals and sell it? I just remember thinking, I spent a year starving. You're gonna take half of my food away. What are you thinking? And he said, no, this is what we'll do. We'll just take half a portion of our meals and sell it. And I'm like, well, how are we gonna survive on half a portion? They only give us enough for the month. It's like, well, what we'll do is that we just have to eat once a day, every day, and sell the rest until we get out of the camp. That's the only way we'll be able to get out of the camp. So we all decided, well, okay, let's do it. So we start selling food every day. A year later, my parents said my dad decided it was time to go, and so remember we took out a map, kind of looking where we should go. So we heard of South Africa. We didn't really know too much about it. We only knew of Johannesburg in South Africa. So I remember we sneaked out of the camp. We're not allowed to get out. So at like 3 o'clock in the morning and started walking. At times we walk for 20 miles, sometimes more. Sometimes we'll catch whatever form of transportation that was available, for us to jump on. And even that within itself was really an interesting journey, driving in the back of a pickup truck, and it's pouring down rain, and you're driving in the middle of nowhere and not really knowing when you're going to get there. So our journey took us from Malawi into Mozambique, which is a country that also had like 20 years of civil war. And we ended up at the border of South Africa and Mozambique. It turns out we didn't have enough money to go to Johannesburg, so we got pretty much suggested to us that we can go to Durban, which was the closest city, and it was cheaper for everybody to go. So we wanted to stick together. And so we're like, well, let's go to Durban. We've never really been there before. We had to sneak again through the borders and pay people to get us across. And we finally got into Durban, and that's how, I remember when we finally got into Durban, it was like a first time encountering a functioning city with a language that we didn't really understand. And that's kind of how life for us started. South Africa was at an interesting place because it's been 2 years since apartheid just ended, and Nelson Mandela just became president. And this was the first time, in my experience, actually coming across again with this new term called racism. I didn't really know you could be hated for your skin color. Maybe it was also just being young, also bad because the area I grew up to something that was really foreign to myself and my family. Like first day at school, which is really interesting too, because I remember they gave me this school uniform. I was too tall for my age, and South African school we had to wear shorts and white shirts and long socks. So they couldn't find things that would fit me. So I ended up wearing really, really tiny little shorts and long black socks, and standing in front of the class. I think everybody has had this experience if you've ever moved town, schools. You're standing in front of your class, and you have to be introduced to your class. And I remember my teacher, Mrs. Moore, introducing me, and she kept talking. I couldn't speak a word of English. I just remember thinking, if I just show my thumbs up and say, "What's up, guys?" They'll all get it. But they ended up laughing at me. I was like, oh. One thing I realized, I hated the fact that I was born Congolese. And all I wanted to do is just be part of the culture. I was always different. I was always the kid with the weird accent, the kid who didn't really fit in, who didn't really look like everybody else. And that's when I started really asking my parents questions as to why we left Congo. At home, my parents were always Congolese pride. They were always about, Congo this, Congo that. The one time I think maybe a combination of being a teenager, I was about 16, 17 years old, and I kind of just got into this huge argument with my mom and dad about why I hated being Congolese and why I was ashamed of it. And so the first time my mom sat me down, my mom and dad, my mom started crying. I could never forget this. And it's like, this is why we left Congo. They started telling us stories. Started telling me stories that they never told us because we were too young to understand or to actually grasp the gravity of what we experienced. And friends, they started telling me stories about friends of mine and family that we knew. These are some of the kids we used to live with, and like how rebel armies. There was this particular family that we knew who used to live closer to us. We used to go over to their house every Sunday for waffles and hang out. Because they move in different part of town, the rebel armies came into their home. Like what they do is that they rape the mom in front of the children, the family, and kill the dad and take the boys into recruit them as soldiers. And it's one thing. I just remember thinking, it's in one thing when you hear these stories from a distance, but it's another when these are people that you've known and loved and respected. And because I had such a vivid image in imagination, I could just, for weeks I had just having nightmares about, the mom being raped, and all of a sudden it turned into my family, and this whole thing of like, I want to change the way things are. I want to end the war in Congo. Even though I was just a refugee kid, I had nothing. I was just this, teenager who was trying to figure out life, but I knew that was so wrong, and nobody was doing anything about it. And so it was just around that time when I started falling in love with music. I just loved the idea of musician, how they would sing about the injustice that was taking place. People like Bono, who would sing about the injustice. The people, just musician. I remember listening to just various artists and just kind of talking. It's like, well, music is the only thing we have. Music is the only way we can express ourselves, and it seems to be the only thing that people actually listen to. So I taught myself how to play guitar, how to sing, and how to play drums. And by the time I graduated from school, I ended up going to jazz school in South Africa. And that was again first introduction to like this huge world of jazz musicians, people like Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and people who really were talking about the injustice, singing about it before anybody else would actually understand what that meant. And I kind of came across this idea of like, before people like Martin Luther King would march on the street, preaching about freedom, jazz musicians were singing about it in smoky speakeasies all over America. And I just fell in love with that. And it was just around that time when I started really understanding the power of media and how powerful it is. It seemed at the time that the only way to change things in Congo, at least to change the world, was be a politician. And I was like, no, there's another way. And realizing the power of American media, people like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre are the most powerful people on earth right now. Like in South Africa, kids who don't hardly have clothes on and who hardly have anything, are captivated by magazines that have written articles about Paris Hilton and what she did last night. From that point, that's when I changed my major because I was doing jazz drumming and jazz vocals and jazz history, and I changed from that into media and communications. It was the only thing closest to, in terms of utilizing media to tell stories. So by the time I was a senior in college, that year there was this thing that came out where they were offering a scholarship to 2 students to study out in Claremont, California. It was a full-ride scholarship and very competitive. It was really sweet. It was covering, including flights, airfare, and everything else. And I remember sitting with my dad, because him and I used to talk a lot. And one of my favorite things to do with my dad was sit together and watch soccer and talk about everything. I just remember this one time, I was just nonchalantly telling him about this cool opportunity. Again, it was one of those things where I'm talking to my dad. It's like when you're talking to your parents, it's like as if they're not really listening to you. It was just kind of one of those frustration things. Like, it's like, well, then you should apply for it. I'm like, Dad, I just told you every reason why I cannot apply for it. I'm not a South African citizen, and so on and so forth. And I remember he switched off the TV and looked at me. I'll never forget this until the day I die. He said these words, it's like, Eve, one thing I've learned in life is this, is that rules that are made by man can also be broken by man. And the man can always change his heart. And for grim on his face, switched back the TV on, and I was like, great, now what? So there was 2 weeks left before the deadline, and so the applications was only for 2 students, and there were a couple hundred people applying for the same thing. So I had to change people's people's hearts so they'll let me apply. And at least that was just the door in. The rest was up to whoever's gonna choose 2 students. And I remember knocking on the office door every day. I used to dread knocking on that door. Back then, a couple times a day, every day. I remember walking into the last day, actually, of the applications, the deadline. And the guy saw me, he's like, oh, it's you again. He was so fed up. He's like, you know what, I don't really care. Just apply, it's not as if you can get selected anyway. And I remember walking into the office, there was hundreds of applications on my right. I'm like, it's great, but at the same time, it's like, wow, what are the chances of actually getting selected above everybody else, And so the cool thing about the scholarship was this: we had to write a letter as to why we should be selected for the scholarship, and if and when selected, how we can change the world. And at that time, I just kind of had, this plan in mind. This is, I'm going to change the world. So I wrote it all down, and I submitted it. I remember it was at least 6 weeks after the applications were submitted, the word came out. The 2 students have been selected. I remember I was sitting in my political science class, and the professor pulled out the list and said, well, there's only one name. Apparently that the name is going to be released later. Just remember my heart beating, because I put all my it's like putting all your eggs in one basket. And they called this name, Karen Peterson, and she was one of the brightest students I knew at my college. And it's all the other names going to be released in about 45 minutes. So my heart is beating, and couldn't really focus for the rest of the class. And I went to talk to her. The local newspapers were there. It was a huge deal. And I went up to her and said, how did you know? It's like, well, they called me yesterday and told me that I actually got it. So I was like, oh my gosh, that means I didn't get it, And so I was like, maybe there might just be a chance that I'll get it. So I decided to go to the scholarships office again, one more time. And luckily this time there was a woman that was working there I've never seen before. I was like, okay, I didn't have to deal with the same guy. That was great. So I remember asking her, playing as if I didn't really know what was going on. I just remember asking her, hey, I was told that you've selected the 2 students. And she's like, yeah, it's Karen Peterson, and she couldn't pronounce my name because my name is spelled Y-V-E-S. She was like, Yves Muya. And I was like, what? It was like one of those moments I was like taken by shock. Actually, I remember just being shocked. I remember, because I remember, imagining being selected for it and how we respond and how I'm going to jump for joy. I was shocked. I just really felt numb. Really couldn't believe the news I heard. And I remember calling my mom, and my parents were like, I got it. And I didn't realize how big of a deal that was until I heard my mom screaming on the other line. And it was this kind of ripple effect of like, my friend we're crying. It's like, you actually got it. And I'm like, yeah, it's really weird. But the cool thing about it wasn't just that I got selected over a couple hundred of students, but it's like there's this community of people really believe I could change the world. That was the coolest thing about it. And I remember flying for the first time internationally, from Durban to Johannesburg, and I was flying from Johannesburg to London. And it was kind of an interesting experience. I just remember I couldn't stop myself from crying. I was just sobbing with tears. But the funny thing is that I was flying over all the countries that I've been through. And I just remember flying because you could track where you are. And I remember playing with mud as a kid in Zambia. We had meeting for 3 days and hoping my dad would bring some food. And all of a sudden I had this flashback in Malawi, laying on the grass on my back, playing all these great tales my dad used to tell me as a kid, and me wishing those tales could come true so badly. And and for the first time, I'm like, here I am, you know, flying to a dream. Here I am, you know, living a dream.